Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Foreign Press Association in New York. And today it's a privilege to speak, very timely privilege, to speak Nahid Siamdoust. Did I get that right?
You got it right, Ian. Thank you.
Okay. Um, who is an Iranian journalist of distinguished pedigree, has written for some of the major publications, Western and Middle Eastern, and is a lecturer in media studies and a student of the effect of media on conflicts. And there's been no more media-ridden conflict than the one that we've just seen unfold in the Middle East. No one seems quite sure who is fighting whom in the end. We know who was fighting, but there are people hovering in the background. So, what attracted me, first of all, was your essay in New Lines magazine about the media in Iran. And I suppose that's the key question if you have an insight. Just Of course, from here, the view is that the Ayatollahs represent a completely unpopular regime that is just waiting to be toppled and replaced by the Shah, well, the Shah's
Mhm.
grandson, and which is wishful thinking on the part of some of them. But then, there are. So, to what extent is there popular support, and to what extent do the recent events, I should say, reinforce the regime or weaken it?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's been an ongoing question, and the reason we don't really know the answers for that question is that Iran has been shut out from sort of the rest of the world by the imposition of these extreme sanctions from the U.S. and the marginalization of Iran in the international community from the outside, but also internally from its own government by, for example, banning a lot of the foreign. They didn't ban Western or foreign reporters, but it's difficult. It has become exceedingly more difficult to get a permit to come and report out of Iran over the last, let's say, 15 years or so since the 2009 Green Uprising. Prior to that, certainly during the reformist era of Mohammad Khatami, which started in 1997 and onward for about 8 years, Iran was really open, and so many reporters went to Iran and reported out of there, and we could kind of engage with Iranian society in a way that we could really understand a whole lot more about it. But after the uprising in 2009, the government itself really clamped down and restricted permits for foreign reporters. It booted out a lot of its resident correspondents of major publications such as the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times, all those major mainstream US publications, within short order lost their correspondence in Tehran. And so that's why we have such a hard read on Iran. But how popular is the government's? It's at the end of the day, it is not. It's not such a difficult question to answer, in part because due to the extreme sanctions, due to the repression by the government, the mismanagement of the economy, corruption, all these internal and external factors have really contributed to a um, gradual but drastic impoverishment of the Iranian population at large, of a shrinking of the Iranian economy, of the free fall of the Iranian rial. On top of that, you have a population that's overwhelmingly young, the median age, I believe, being 34. Overwhelmingly young and connected to the world. One of the things that the Islamic Republic has not managed to do, unlike a place like North Korea, for example, is that because of the size of the population, because it is such a young progressive population at large, I would argue that Iran is probably the most secular country in the Middle East as far as the population is concerned. And because it's such a population with links to the outside world, lots of families, I would say almost, half of Iranians, if not more, have families who live abroad in Europe, in America, in Asia. And so Iranians are really well connected to the world. And so, one thing the Islamic Republic has not managed is really to shut down those kinds of connections, the, social media connections, the communications to the
Is there
outside
a
world.
rural-urban divide? Like in Turkey, Erdogan's Islamist
Mhm.
support came from the heartland of Anatolia.
That's right.
as
That's right.
opposed to the cities. So is there anything like that in Iran?
Not as much, because Iran is a majority urban society. And so the majority of Iranians live in the urban or smaller urban centers. You have a lot of big cities like Tehran, Mashhad, Tabriz, Shiraz, Isfahan, Kashan, Kerman. It's a very big country, but it's also a very diverse country and a very urbanized country. So that kind of divide, sort of rural urban, doesn't apply as much to Iran. It does a little bit, but not as much as a place like Turkey, for example. And so, Iranians are well connected, and they can see, they have both this understanding of themselves internally, but they also have sort of an external eye on themselves, and they can see, they can compare their own societies, their own economy to others in the Middle East. There's always this comparison to the Arab Gulf, the Gulf countries in the Persian Gulf, the Arab Gulf countries, which, 46, 7 years ago, when the revolution happened, they were really backwaters. They were, firstly, they're, newish countries as nation states, but also really underdeveloped. And Iran was, this super developed nation in the Middle East. And how, you can't even compare, Iran with those countries anymore in terms of their development of their technologies, of their economies, and infrastructure, and all of that. And so, um, Iranians are not happy with what they've got. A majority of Iranians, I would argue, do want to get beyond the Islamic Republic, and in fact, they've demonstrated that. They've come out into the streets, in a huge protest after protest, the 2009 Green Uprising, the 2017 sort of gas strikes, the 2019 and 2020 November strike, and there or protests, and then the 2022 incredible woman life freedom movement, which was really cross-sectional, national, inter-ethnic, I mean, all the people across Iran. It really crossed a lot of different categorical borders in terms of, work, ethnicity, language, religion. And so, they all came out to ask for a really a complete change in their government, not just reforms, but a different system. A majority of people do not no longer believe in being governed by an Islamic government, because once you bring in religion
Which is
into.
why, of course, the Ayatollahs have got this whole rigmarole of approved candidates and councils of elders, etc., etc.
That's right. That's right. And so, because of that, you have Iranians do want to get beyond the Islamic Republic, but that doesn't mean that they welcomed this recent, attack by, the Israeli military aggression or the American bombs, because they've been working very hard to get to, to bring about a different future. And as much as you'll have some Iranians who will say, well, we can't do it. We've tried it all. We've gone out into the streets. The only thing that can save us and, bring down the Islamic Republic is foreign intervention. A majority of them are also very savvy, and they know and they understand that foreign intervention has not led to positive outcomes for any of the countries
Well,
where this is
one of the
happening.
negative outcomes of foreign intervention was, of course, the Pahlavis. So, to what extent is everybody waiting to wave lion flags and welcome the Shah back?
Right. So, I mean, Reza Pahlavi does have his supporters in Iran, but he is just seen as a sort of irrelevant, political figure by most Iranians, I would argue. And, I think he has the degree of his support within Iran is, is sort of is larger because of the way in which foreign powers, the US, Saudi Arabia, Israel, have invested into media, sort of blowing him up as the next leader of Iran through media that many Iranians consume. There's a media vacuum in Iran, right? Because state media is staunchly pro-regime. A majority of Iranians don't consume that and take it as, take it as sort of as the sort of word of truth. They kind of take it with a
You
huge
mean
grain of salt.
little dumpy women in black chadors waving when the bomb hits?
I mean, that woman is somebody who went on state media after Masajina Amini died in detention post, that was what, and was killed in morality police detention. That is what caused the 2022 woman life freedom uprising. And that woman that anchor that we've been seeing sort of held up
Oh,
by
that woman, I like it. Go on, with
by
gestures, please.
by unknowing sort of well-meaning anti-imperialist sort of protesters are holding up a poster of her photograph as if she was some kind of sign of resistance, and she's not. She is the symbol of oppression and repression in post-revolutionary Iran. She's someone who went on state media and said, well, Mahsa Amini deserved to die because she didn't have the right cover. Or if you, and another time she went on state television and said, if you don't like what you have here in Iran, you're welcome to leave. We don't keep people back in Iran. Leave. Iran is not yours. And so she is the symbol of state repression and oppression in Iran. And state media are, because they have for decades fabricated stories against the sort of the you know insulting, offending the intelligence and integrity of Iranians, of telling them stories that they know are absolutely untrue, evidently untrue. But Lisa Wedeen, who's written on Syria, writes this about the Assad regime, whereby everybody knows those stories are untrue. That is not really the point of that kind of propaganda. The point is to show the population that the state has that kind of force and violence to impose its narrative through the national airwaves on a population that very well knows those narratives are wrong, right? That is the force of that.
Well, we have to. One of the things I wanted to discuss with you as well is the role of useful idiots who take what the state television says, as they did. Assad still has his supporters. Putin still has supporters, and so we have people who are backing the Iranian regime as anti-imperialist.
That's the thing, Ian. We have to be able to hold multitudes when it comes to Iran, because it's a very complex society. It has a very complex history. Just because we're anti imperialists and oppose US attacks on Iran, oppose Israeli attacks on Iran, it does not mean we have to support the Islamic Republic. A majority of Iranians have been fighting to bring about changes to their own government to finally achieve liberty and democracy and freedom, something the Islamic Revolution promised them in 1979. That's why people had a
I remember.
revolution. Yeah, and still have not attained. And back then you mentioned that Reza Pahlavi is the son of the former Shah. Yes, the former Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was reinstituted in 1953 after Iranians had a very grassroots democratic movement for liberation, elected back then the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who nationalized Iranian oil. This made the UK extremely mad, and the US got on board. And Operation, the coup d'état operation of 1953 against Mossadegh happened, and they brought back the son of the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the father of the current sort of contender to the throne, back to Iran and reimposed him on the throne after having deposed the democratically elected prime minister of Iran who had nationalized Iranian oil, right?
But it's
So,
interesting. No, I just want to pick up on free
mhm,
association here. Is the Shah then was pursuing nuclear weapons with the support of the United States, wasn't he?
that's right. In the, I believe, early sort of mid 60s, the ideas were sort of ignited, I believe, by President
Eisenhower,
Eisenhower's
Atoms for
Atoms
Peace.
for
So.
Peace. That was that there the idea was ignited, but then they helped Iran develop its peaceful nuclear program. And some of the people who worked on that were still alive, up until a few years ago. They've unfortunately, since the main man, Iranian man in charge of that, unfortunately has now passed on. But you know, the Iranian peaceful sort of civilian nuclear program was supported by the U.S. and yeah, and continued for decades without really any issues, in part because the IAEA is the agency in charge responsible for monitoring Iran's nuclear program. And Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and was having some of the most stringent, uh, regulations imposed on it by the IAEA. This all kind of turned in part because, Benjamin Netanyahu plays a very important role in this story. He has gone on a personal sort of um, what should we call it, on a personal um, drive to undo Iran's nuclear program. He's claimed since 1995 and onward. I'm
But
sure
this is
you've seen these
this
clips
is the same government that was selling weapons to Iran.
during the 1980s in the Iran Contra.
Yes.
Well, actually,
I
Iran
mean, one
Contra
of the
affair was the
advisors in the
U.S.,
current
but the
government is
advisor.
Colonel North, who was in charge
Mhm.
of arms deals with the Iranian regime at the time.
That's right. During the Iran-Iraq War, Israel, did sell arms to Iran, and this is because Iran and, as you know, Iran and Israel were allies in the pre-revolutionary era, and of course, those personal bonds between people don't just melt away once the regime changes, and so some of those people became also important people in the subsequent government. And were able to bring about some of those deals with the Israelis to get arms. I mean, at the end of the day, during the Iran-Iraq War, the Western world, in particular, but also Israel, they were arming both sides to the teeth, selling their weapons so that the Iranians and Iraqis could just, kill the hell out of each other.
I think Kissinger actually said that, didn't he? He said he wanted them both to win and both to lose in a very
Mhm.
cynical way.
Right.
um, and no, I remember well that those of us who opposed the Baathists in Iraq were rather amazed to discover it made us completely unpatriotic and undemocratic when we suggested
Mhm. Mhm.
afterwards the
Mhm.
bombing 6 types of excreta out of him and the
Mhm.
Iranian people was not necessarily the best
Mhm.
step forward. Um,
Yeah.
but what's the effect? Do the Iranians have access to foreign media? Can they get on the internet? Can they can they get social media? Can they well, could they get Reuters or even Al Jazeera from outside?
100%. They're all very well connected. They can access all kinds of media. Some of it is filtered or blocked by the Iranian government, but pretty much every single Iranian is very well versed in having VPNs, virtual private networks that allow them to circumvent that kind of censorship by the state. Everybody works with VPNs. If you're using internet in Iran, you're on there through VPNs that reroute you through, let's say Russia or some other country that doesn't block those sites. So everybody's well connected. However, majority of Iranians aren't super fluent in English, right? To read these foreign or English or other language news sources. And so what they rely on are Persian language news sources. And it's no surprise that, all these major news outlets, the BBC, Voice of America, Iran International, Al Arabiya, from all the different regions have a Persian language network among like five or six,
Does
you
the
know.
VOA still?
Yeah, the VOA is still continuing. Yeah, I
Oh,
know
that's
they
right. They
were.
had to bring everybody. They fired them all and then they brought
Yes,
them back again.
that's right.
Thanks
That's
to
right.
stroke of genius from Musk, the great genius of the world.
That's right. And so they're back, they've been back on. And all these Persian language services to Iran are in great part, I would say, except for maybe what they are tinted by the politics and the interests of the countries that fund those services. So a majority of Iranians are unfortunately at the behest of networks like Iran International, which is Saudi funded but has 100% sort of pro-Israeli politics. And so the politics of these countries, especially sort of pro-Israeli adjacent politics, has really filtered the way in which Iranians receive their news. I think that's a big factor in why an out a disproportionately perhaps larger segment of Iranians, both in the diaspora who also consume those media outlets, and inside Iran may be taken by narratives about Reza Pahlavi when on the ground, he does not have the kind of popularity that is often presented in the West.
What
Um,
about the pop? Because the other issue that's involved there, which you just touched upon, is the Middle East question and the Palestinians. Now, we've found in other parts of the Middle East, like Morocco, where the regime is the king is most sort of consistently historically pro-Israeli of the lot. The population is still overwhelmingly anti, and even in Egypt, you know, 40 years after the peace treaty. It's a very brave Israeli tourist who goes out on their own in the streets of Cairo.
Hmm.
Um, so, to what extent is this reflected in Iranian perceptions of the conflict? Because I think a lot of, a lot of, I read some of the briefings for people going that the Bush's invasion of Iraq was based on, and the assumption was that the Iraqi, any new Iraqi regime would immediately recognize Israel, open a pipeline, and be best friends. Um,
Hmm.
and this was a very dubious proposition at the time. Since then, the dubiety has been completely exposed. What's the relation in Iran with the Middle East conflict?
It's a little bit complicated. The Islamic Republic, because at the from its very inception, it has supported the Palestinian cause, and the Palestinian cause in Iran, in the Iranian public's mind, has been conflated with a sort of government that is funding other Islamist policy, polities or other Islamic populations or militias in the region, as opposed to investing those funds into the Iranian population and infrastructure itself. There's a lot of resentment. And so, equivocating sort of Palestinians with the Islamic Republic has never been to the benefit of Palestinians. However, that is less the case with the younger population coming about, in Iran, as it is with the younger populations the world over, right? They have now learned the history. It's been on their social media screens every single day. They've engaged with it. They understand the historical and political issues, and they are more likely to have an understanding of the situation that is much more measured. And most certainly, since October 7th, we see a lot of Iranians just, having a whole lot of sympathy, a whole lot more than ever before with the Palestinian cause and with the Palestinians, because they've seen the images of, you know, tens of thousands of Palestinians being killed, many more being starved, and this is something they're receiving in their news as well. And so we see, expressions of solidarity and of empathy and sympathy with the Palestinian people. And Netanyahu is most definitely, as much as he would like to see himself as a savior of Iran, this is what we see in sort of Israeli media and pro-Israeli media of him as sort of the person who's guiding the rising lion to rescue Iran. He's a pretty hated character in Iran right now.
Which not the type of insight you get from most of the Western press.
No, and because the Western press is still to a large extent influenced by the kind of previous framework that existed, as was, I think, a lot of pro sort of Israeli lobbying and media. This, I think, this became really, really evident when this new war started. What I saw in the press was, instead of people, journalists really doing their job and looking at the story and figuring out who's doing what and what regulations are in there, what is happening, they all, many, not all, let me just take that back, but many of them really just instantly entered this older framework of Iran is the threat and Israel and America are there to liberate the Western world by bombing its nuclear sites. When Israel, the aggressor, is a state that has been carrying out a mass annihilation of another people for nearly 2 years, is committing grave war crimes, right? Hundreds of war crimes we've heard from the International Criminal Court and Court of Justice. And so the aggressor is actually a war criminal coming to Iran. Iran has been a signatory to the NPT. It has been stringently sort of investigated for more than 2 decades. And by Israeli and US intelligence accounts, by their own accounts, was at least 6 to 12 months away from sort of the breakout moment, right, of being able to actually put together a
And
nuclear
subject
bomb.
to a fatwa about the immorality and illegality of nuclear weapons.
Exactly. And both intelligences had actually concluded that they had no plans to make a bomb. But all of that kind of apparently became completely irrelevant. And instantly, if you watch CBS, NBC, sorry, CBS, ABC, CNN, actually, you were thrown into this framework of thinking Iran was about to annihilate Israel. And so somehow Israel had a right to come and bomb not just military and nuclear sites. This is also an underreported story, certainly in the Western world. Um, but civilian sites, media infrastructures, electricity infrastructures, satellite bases, hospitals, right? They bombed so many civilian centers, killed up to 1,000 people. We still don't know the exact number of casualties, but anywhere around 800 to 1,000. And so the story is was still not reported
Well,
properly.
this is where, over the years, I've interviewed and spoken to many Iranian dissidents, some of whom fled and only escaped by the skin of their heels from the regime. And I never found one who didn't, there must have existed, but who didn't stoutly say, yes, we're entitled to a nuclear program. And
You
if
never found
necessary,
one
we're
who said
entitled
that,
to nuclear weapons. This is many dissidents I've spoken to over the years.
who did not say we're entitled to it, or
Yeah, no, they said we are
yeah,
entitled to them.
yeah,
As a matter
absolutely,
of
yeah,
patriotism,
yes.
hey, you you're treating us as a banana republic. If you can have them, we can.
That's right. And that's what the IAEA is for. That's what the NPT is for, to make sure countries can only use them for civilian purposes, right? And so I would say up until even, you know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, you would be pressed to find any Iranian who would say nuclear energy is not our natural right, right? It was a very patriotic issue. The majority of Iranians were behind it. But then when it started to look like, because of this program, the US was going to bring Iran to its knees with its extreme sanctions, really impoverish the population, to rates that nobody's seen in Iran before. Something like 30% of Iranians now live below the poverty line. This is a super rich country, right? It's super rich in resources, in human capital, in industry. This is a very wealthy nation that should be up there in the G20. And so, for Iranians to see their sort of, living standards plummet because of these extreme sanctions imposed, presumably, because of Iran's nuclear program, slowly people started sort of retracting their
Well,
support
I'm
for
not
the
quite.
nuclear
Yeah, I mean,
program.
this is where we have to disambiguate, because to what extent the nuclear program is being used as an excuse for Netanyahu, because
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't believe he really thought that Iran was going to annihilate Israel, but he did want to neutralize the. Well, he's proven with Syria and with Iraq. He wants to neutralize any other sources of opposition in the region.
That's right. When you look at Syria, when you look at Lebanon, in Syria, even though there was a change of government, the Israeli forces continued after Ashar had taken reign as the new sort of leader of Syria, continued bombing its naval and air forces, its military and other kinds of important sort of key civilian infrastructures that uphold the state. Basically, in many ways, it was the undoing of the state. And so we have to ask, what is the end goal? Is the end goal for Israel to basically undo state infrastructures and the rest of the Middle East so that it can reign supreme over a sort of graveyard set of countries that are just barely scraping by? And how does that serve Israeli interests? How does that serve anyone? And so that was certainly happening in Iran. And I think a majority of analysts have, outside of mainstream media, have come around to arguing that this certainly was not just this was not about undoing an Iranian sort of nuclear weapons threat, because there wasn't any by their own accounts, by their own intelligence accounts, but really to just subdue the Iranian state as a whole. And
We have a
yes.
process of demonization by association. So
Hmm.
all you have to do is to say the Iran-backed Houthis, or the
Yeah,
Iranian-backed Hamas, or Iran, and you don't need any more evidence, because
that's
that's
it. Yeah,
sufficient unto itself to prove that these are evil people to be extirpated
that's right.
at
That's
all
right.
costs.
That's right. Exactly. Iran is now, a sort of byword for evil somehow. Yeah.
So, for the future, what can be, look, two things, if you could summarize. What can the Western media do to make sure that their coverage is objective and consonant with reality on the ground? And secondly, what's the outcome for Iran? Is I think we can discount the reinstallation of the Shah on the peacock throne, but what are the realistic prospects for a change of regime?
Well, I don't know. I really, unfortunately, I think that these recent attacks will further embolden, the Islamic Republic in its ways. I have a tiny bit of sort of 2% hope that they'll look at the situation and that they'll say, our population didn't rise up against us at this gravest hour. They didn't rise up against us, and let us give them a few more freedoms and let's try to bring about more peace and prosperity and democracy in Iran. Maybe we'll stop our nuclear program if that's what it takes for the West, and have re-engage so that the sanctions are taken off, so that we have better economic relations, and just start bringing more economy and prosperity to Iran, and also easing up things on the political and social
But how
front.
can they do that when the West, when they're negotiating with somebody who, in good faith, to reinstall a deal that the President of the United States reneged on, and then he bombs them, he bombs you while you're talking. I mean,
Exactly.
you
Exactly.
don't have to love the Ayatollahs to see that they do have a point.
Absolutely. And pride is an important thing for the Iranian leaders, and to do that they'd really have to sort of forego this sort of this stature that they've built up in their
And be
rhetoric and
vilified by the
ideology.
population as unpatriotic, possibly, if they did it.
Yeah, that's right. Potentially that too. Although I will say, I think the majority of Iranians just want better relations with the world so that they can improve their lives, right? Over the last what has happened in Iran over the last 3 decades or more is an extreme brain drain, right? Our best and brightest leave the country. Iranian universities are still excellent enough that people can go from a top Iranian university from, that university to MIT, Stanford. This is still happening, but it's becoming so much harder for Iranians to be able to do that, even if they are geniuses, because the currency has dropped, has basically, just completely plummeted to a point where people can't even pay to go to their visa appointments in third countries. There's no U.S. embassy in Iran. They have to go to Armenia or Dubai or whatnot. So things have changed drastically for Iranians, even for the best and brightest. And so, I think a majority of Iranians just want to have a more normal life, have better relations with the West, and they're willing to swallow some of their pride, and just be able to change their realities. Because at the end of the day, the way things are continuing for Iranians, are not tenable for a population that deserves so much more, because they have all the sort of potential that you could possibly have as a population, as a nation. So that's kind of
Speaking
my
of the
2%.
brightest and the best, what what are you doing now, and where can people see what you're producing?
Oh, that's kind of you. I'm a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. I teach Middle Eastern and media studies, so most of my work is working with students. And you know, I do have a podcast series called Iran Cast. We discuss new works out on Iran. I write articles every now and then that I publish in various publications, New Lines Magazine, Foreign Policy, the New York Times, and that's it. I've got a couple books out: Soundtrack of the Revolution, The Politics of Music in Iran, which came out a few years ago. And I have another one coming out this year called Iran Amplified, Music and Society Over 100 Years. I really like to look at the field of sort of culture and what we learn through culture production about a society. And I think in Iran's case, music is a huge register for understanding Iranian society and what it cares about, and the kinds of discussions, but also sort of the contention with a state that tries to regulate culture, but to what extent it is willing to let go of certain things and allow for certain spaces to exist, and to what extent producers are able to create those spaces for conversation and a larger public sphere. Um,
Okay, well, look,
yeah,
do send us the link, and we'll make sure it goes out to recipients and gets put up. It's Iran Cast, the
the
podcast.
podcast series, yes.
Okay, we'll make sure that goes out, and
Thank you.
Look, thanks very much, and do keep in touch. It's
Thank,
been
yeah.
a more lucid than usual discussion, although I say it myself.
Thank you so much for having me, Ian. It's been such a pleasure meeting you and having this conversation with you. I really appreciate it.
And ditto, likewise, and amplified. But thanks. You give us a call if you're in New York. Who knows?
Great. Thank you so much. Really
Thank
great
you.
meeting you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.